For centuries, the Galactic Council had ruled over the known universe with the arrogance of gods. It was a council of the old, of empires that had seen thousands of years pass like dust in the wind, civilizations that had long forgotten what it meant to struggle, to fight for survival. They dictated laws, established borders, and decided the fate of entire species with the flick of a wrist. And they had always underestimated humanity. From the moment Earth's people had joined the stars, they had been looked down upon. Too emotional, the elders had said, too reckless, too unpredictable, too chaotic. When humans defied the odds and thrived in the void of space, the Council had merely tolerated them. When they broke records in scientific advancement, they dismissed it as beginner's luck. And when they bled for the galaxy, when their soldiers fought and died in wars that were not their own, when their doctors healed the sick of worlds they had never seen, when their engineers repaired failing planetary infrastructures that others had neglected, there were no thanks, no recognition. Humanity accepted this. They worked, they built, they survived, and they endured. They endured when the Zalari Confederacy taxed their colonies into poverty, forcing them to pay for protection against raiders who suspiciously only attacked human settlements. They endured when the wealthy Hegrosh Dominion manipulated trade laws, turning Earth into a supplier of cheap labor while hoarding the riches of the stars for themselves. They endured when human diplomats were laughed out of council chambers, their pleas for fair treatment falling on deaf ears. And even when Mars burned, when a bioweapon was released into its atmosphere, killing 2 million civilians, humanity did not retaliate. They focused on curing the plague instead of seeking vengeance. They rebuilt their cities, mourned their dead, and moved forward. The other species saw this as weakness. The humans were passive. They talked too much. They negotiated too much. They allowed themselves to be pushed around. But every civilization has its breaking point. For humanity, that moment came when the Viraxis Imperium attacked New Kyoto. New Kyoto was one of Earth's most advanced colonies, a beacon of peace and progress. It was not a military outpost, not a strategic resource hub, just a world of scientists, explorers, and families. The Viraxis Imperium raided it without warning, without provocation. They descended upon the city in the dead of night, slaughtering civilians as they slept. Thousands of men, women, and children were butchered, their bodies left to drift in the vacuum of space as a warning to humanity. The Council did nothing. The humans sent envoys. They demanded justice. The Council laughed in their faces. The Viraxis Imperium issued a statement. This was a necessary demonstration. Humanity must learn its place. For the first time in history, humanity had no response. No messages, no threats, no diplomatic discussions, just silence. At first, the galaxy thought they were grieving, licking their wounds as they always did. Then, as weeks passed, species began to wonder. Human embassies across Council space were abandoned. Trade routes leading to human territories went dark. The hyperplanes that connected their colonies to the rest of the galaxy were deactivated. A cold unease settled over the Council. Then came the disappearances. A Hegrosh mining station, located deep within their empire, suddenly ceased transmissions. Investigation teams were sent, only to find the facility eerily intact, except for the fact that every single person inside had vanished without a trace. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. Then, the Bloodfang, a Zalari warship stationed near human territory, was discovered adrift in space. Its crew, seasoned warriors trained in combat, were gone. The ship's logs had been wiped clean, except for a single message displayed on every screen. Justice is not requested, it is taken. The Council panicked. The disappearances continued. Trade convoys vanished in human space. Entire military outposts went silent overnight. Some planetary governors even reported waking up one morning to find their entire administration missing, replaced by a single black monolith standing in the center of their cities, its surface etched with symbols of forgotten human languages. The Council scrambled to make sense of it. The Vraxis Imperium, arrogant and foolish, dismissed the warnings. "Let the humans have their tantrum," they said. "They will come crawling back, begging for mercy, as they always do." They did not realize that humanity had finally lost its patience. When the first human fleet emerged from subspace, the galaxy expected warships, bristling with weapons, ready to wage a desperate war against impossible odds. They expected fiery speeches, demands for vengeance, maybe even a doomed last stand. They were wrong. Humanity did not come for war. They came for erasure. The first attack was not on a military installation, nor a border world. It was on Vraxis Prime, the heart of the Vraxis Imperium itself. A fleet of unmanned drones descended upon the planet, moving with a precision that no organic being could match. They did not target cities. They did not target civilians. They targeted existence itself. Monuments crumbled into dust. Libraries filled with centuries of history were reduced to blank pages. Digital archives were wiped clean, rewritten to show only static. Political leaders vanished. Entire bloodlines were erased. Even the memory of the Vraxis Imperium was being stripped away, piece by piece. Survivors, those few who managed to flee, spoke in hushed whispers of something worse than death. Some reported waking up to find their families gone, their homes empty, their own reflections in the mirror distorted as if reality itself was unraveling. Others claimed that when they tried to speak the name of their empire, the words died in their throats, as if the universe itself refused to acknowledge them. The council was paralyzed. They had never seen weapons like this. This was not war. This was unmaking. The Zalari Confederacy, desperate to avoid the same fate, begged for mercy. They sent messages to Earth, offering reparations, surrendering unconditionally. Humanity responded with a single transmission. Mercy was for yesterday. Their worlds fell next. The Hogarash Dominion, once the wealthiest and most powerful trade empire in the galaxy, found their economy annihilated overnight. Their wealth, their data, their very identities, gone. Their banks showed zeros where once they had held unthinkable riches. Their leaders were found wandering the streets of their homeworld, unable to recognize their own names. The Galactic Council crumbled. Worlds turned on each other in panic, desperate to distance themselves from humanity's wrath. Treaties were rewritten overnight. Races that had mocked and oppressed humanity for centuries now sent envoys to Earth pleading for forgiveness. Finally, after weeks of terror, a single broadcast was sent from human space. A simple message displayed in every language of the galaxy. This is the peace you denied us. This is the justice you refused us. This is the patience you shattered. The age of indulgence is over. From now on, you will not ask what humanity wants. You will obey. And the galaxy did, because no species would ever forget the moment when humans finally lost their patience. The silence that followed humanity's disappearance from the galactic stage had been unsettling. But what came after was worse. The disappearances were only the beginning. At first, the Council tried to dismiss them as isolated incidents, unfortunate accidents, pirate attacks, navigational errors. But the pattern was undeniable. Every missing ship, every vanished station, every erased outpost had one thing in common: all had wronged humanity in some way. Fear spread like wildfire among the high-ranking officials of the Galactic Council. The arrogance that had once fueled their rule began to waver. They had ignored the warnings, dismissed the growing tension, believing that humans, with all their unpredictability and emotion, would never be capable of true, organized retribution. They had been wrong. When the Vraxis Imperium's homeworld was unmade, it was not by fire or explosions, not by mass bombings or orbital strikes. It was by something far more insidious, something the galaxy had no words for. Entire archives of history disappeared overnight, their records turned to gibberish. Statues of past emperors stood in their grand halls, unrecognizable. their faces smoothed over as if time itself had forgotten them. People fled their cities in blind panic, only to find that their escape routes no longer led where they should. Some never escaped at all. The few who managed to reach other systems spoke in hushed, trembling voices of the things they had seen, of cities that crumbled without a sound, of families who went to sleep and simply never woke up, of streets where entire districts once stood, now nothing but barren land as if they had never existed, and worst of all, the forgetting. The way their own minds betrayed them, unable to recall the names of their ancestors, their leaders, their own history. It was as though their empire had never been. The remaining members of the council convened in desperation. The great rulers of the galaxy, beings who had once held dominion over countless species and planets, now huddled together in whispered fear. They had always believed themselves untouchable. They had built fleets to repel invaders, armies to crush rebellions, defenses so advanced that no species could ever challenge their authority. But what use were weapons against an enemy that did not attack in the ways they had prepared for? How did one fight something that did not come with fleets or soldiers, but instead erased the very fabric of a civilization's identity? The Zellery Confederacy attempted to send envoys, offering reparations, desperate to appease humanity before their turn came. Their ships entered human space and were never seen again. No wreckage, no distress signals, no evidence they had ever existed at all. The messages they sent beforehand were garbled upon arrival, unreadable even to their own linguists. It was as if the universe itself was rejecting their plea. The Hegrosh Dominion fared no better. Their economy collapsed overnight as their financial networks failed, their credits reduced to meaningless symbols. Their leaders awoke to find their personal vaults emptied, their fortunes erased. Records of their transactions, their assets, even their very names began to disappear from official documentation. Within days, their once glorious empire was reduced to a scattered, terrified people, unable to explain how they had fallen so swiftly. Then the humans spoke. Not through embassies, not through negotiations, but through a single transmission that echoed across every frequency, across every world that had ever dismissed them. It was a voice, but not a single voice. It was many, layered upon each other, a chorus of whispers and fury. This is not war. This is not vengeance. This is correction. You were warned. That was all. Panic spread faster than any invasion ever could. Entire governments collapsed, their leaders fleeing to the farthest reaches of space, hoping, praying that distance would spare them. It did not. On the core world of the Zellery, the High Chancellor, once one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, found herself trapped in a palace that no longer remembered her. The doors would not open for her. The automated systems did not recognize her voice. When she called for her guards, they looked at her with empty expressions, unable to recall why they... On the trade hubs of the Hegrosh, merchants found that their customers no longer existed. Markets stood empty. Once thriving ports turned into ghost towns overnight. When they tried to recall the names of their business partners, they found only silence in their minds. The worst was what happened to the council itself. Their grand hall, the place where they had once dictated the fates of entire civilizations, was found abandoned, its records wiped clean. No one remembered when it had happened. No one remembered why. The names of the council members were gone from every database. Even those who had once served within its walls found themselves unable to recall the faces of their colleagues, the words of their past decrees, the very purpose of their existence. Humanity had done something far worse than wage war. They had removed, not with weapons, not with brute force. They had reached into the very heart of the galaxy's history and rewritten it. Those who remained now lived in the shadow of an invisible hand that had rewritten the laws of power. The species that had once mocked humanity now lived in terrified obedience. The laws of the galaxy had changed, but no one could quite remember when or how. No one could remember who had decreed it, only that the consequences of defiance were absolute. Trade routes were redirected to human-controlled sectors, but no one could remember making the decision. Diplomats ensured that human interests were prioritized above all else, but no one could recall who had signed the treaties. Even the maps of the galaxy had shifted, subtly altered to emphasize human space, to remind every species, every empire, of who now held control. And still, humanity said nothing. There were no grand speeches, no triumphant declarations. They simply existed, silent and watchful, an ever-present force that needed no acknowledgement. They had become something more than an empire, more than a military power. They had become inevitable. No species would ever forget the moment when humans finally lost their patience, because those who did no longer existed. The universe had changed, though no one could say exactly when. The great empires that had once dictated the fate of the galaxy now moved carefully, cautiously, their leaders speaking in hushed tones whenever the subject of humanity arose. The Galactic Council no longer convened in its grand halls. What remained of it now met in secret, in dimly lit chambers, whispering of how to proceed in a galaxy that no longer obeyed the old rules. It had not been war. There were no great battles recorded, no fleets clashing in the void, no heroes to commemorate. There were no treaties of surrender, no terms dictated at the barrel of a plasma rifle. Instead, there was silence. A silence that had begun the moment humanity had withdrawn from the Council. A silence that had stretched across months, then years, until the universe itself seemed to shift in response to it. Entire species that had once stood at the pinnacle of power now lived in a state of uneasy reverence. They did not know when it had started, only that they had awakened one day to find themselves obeying new laws, following new structures, and prioritizing human interests above all else. No one could remember drafting the new trade agreements, yet they were there, encoded into the very framework of interstellar commerce. No one recalled approving the massive funding projects that poured resources into human research, yet they continued without question. No one had signed the treaties that gave humanity full control over hyperlane access, yet the gateways bowed to them, bending reality itself in their favor. There were whispers of something worse, something that could not be spoken too loudly, for fear that the very act of speaking might draw attention. They had tried to fight it at first. The Zalari Confederacy had assembled what remained of its war fleet, determined to resist the quiet stranglehold that had wrapped around their civilization like an unseen hand. Their ships had been sent toward the Sol system, weapons primed, crews steeled for battle. None of them returned. At first, the Zalari waited for word, for any sign of what had happened. But there were no wreckages, no distress signals, no reports of engagement. The fleet was simply gone. And worse still, when they tried to recall the details of the mission, the names of the ships, the admirals who had commanded them, even the date they had been sent, there was nothing. Empty records, blank spaces in their archives. The few who still remembered the fleet at all spoke of it only in vague terms, as if their minds refused to hold on to the details. They never tried again. The Hegrash Dominion, once the wealthiest empire in the known universe, had suffered a different fate. Their economy had collapsed in a single night, not through war or sabotage, but through something far stranger. Their banks had not been emptied, their resources had not been stolen. Rather, they had simply ceased to be. Entire financial records were erased from existence. Wealth that had once been measurable in planetary scales now existed only as memories, and even those memories faded with time. The remaining council members, scattered and desperate, attempted to convene one final time, hoping to find some way to reverse what had happened. They met in a hidden station, far from prying eyes, hoping that secrecy might protect them from the same fate that had befallen the others. It did not. The station was discovered days later, adrift in space, its systems intact, its life support still active, but there were no bodies, no signs of struggle, no indication that the Council had ever been there at all. And yet, the galaxy continued. The trade routes remained active, the governments continued to function, the colonies grew, expanded, flourished. There were no wars, no uprisings, no chaos. Everything simply worked, as if the universe itself had been rewritten to ensure that it would. The only constant was humanity. Their fleets never patrolled the hyperlanes, yet no ship dared violate their territories. Their armies never deployed, yet their will was obeyed without question. They never raised their voices in demand, yet their influence was absolute. And so the galaxy lived under the rule of a people who no longer needed to rule at all. There was no rebellion, no resistance. How could there be, when the very concept of opposition seemed to slip from the minds of those who considered it? There were still those who tried to remember. Scholars and archivists, driven by a desperate need to understand what had happened, dug through the fragments of history that remained. They searched for evidence of the wars that had never been fought, the battles that had never taken place, the negotiations that had never occurred. But their records failed them. The deeper they searched, the more they found nothing but gaps, holes where knowledge should have been, shadows of events that no longer existed. The few who came close to understanding would one day wake up with no memory of their research, their work erased, as if it had never been. Eventually they stopped searching. And so life continued. The great empires of the galaxy, once so proud, now lived as caretakers of a peace they did not fully understand. Their rulers governed as they always had, yet they knew, deep down, that they were no longer the true architects of their destinies. Humanity remained silent, not absent, not hidden, just silent, watching, waiting, existing in a way that defied explanation. There were no more attacks, no more disappearances, no more punishments. Because there was no longer a need. No species would ever forget the moment when humans finally lost their patience. And those who did were never seen again.